For many Dungeons & Dragons campaigns, there is no more iconic and quintessential adventuring environment than the dungeon. Dungeon masters themselves will spend hours, days even, planning out meticulously crafted dungeons, filling them with mazes, traps, monsters, mind-bending puzzles, epic treasures, and climactic encounters for the player characters to explore, adventure through, defeat, and claim as their very own.
And then the group of players arrive on that dungeon, and they look upon the treasure and traps laid out before them, and they turn to each other, and they say, I have a few tricks that can completely get us past this whole thing. And then they pull out a few tricky spells and bypass the dungeon entirely.
My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we discuss everything Dungeons & Dragons, including advice for dungeon masters and guides for players.
We upload new videos every Thursday, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Today, we are breaking down 5 and a few supplemental spells that players can use to bypass dungeon encounters and environments. Many of these spells are quite low level and allow for tactics and strategies that players can use when exploring dungeon environments that can completely derail the dungeon master's plans.
For you DMs out there watching this, these are spells that you're going to want to be aware of your party taking, because they could foil several of the plans that you've spent a lot of time planning out. And for those players out there who are getting into some pretty tough dungeons and wondering, how can we get the edge? These are the spells that you want to pay attention to.
There's always a balance to be struck between challenging your players and rewarding their creativity. We're going to talk about how to manage that as we look at each of these spells in detail. There's a lot to discuss, so let's get rolling.
Before we jump into today's list of spells, just something to be aware of for you DMs out there is that your players will epically destroy the plans that you have carefully thought out. That's kind of the point of Dungeons & Dragons. But we should be looking for opportunities to reward our players for their creative solutions while still maintaining a level of difficulty.
In the moment, it can be really hard to not get salty when you had this amazing encounter planned and the players reveal that they have a completely amazing plan that will totally short-circuit it. But it's important to learn patience and grace in those moments and allow the players to have their win. At the same time, we always want to be thinking ahead as Dungeon Masters and find new and compelling ways to challenge our player characters and make them come up with more creative and inventive solutions next time so that they don't fall back onto the same old tactics every single time they encounter a new dungeon or adventure.
With that, let's take a look at our list of spells and how players can use them and how DMs can subvert them.
So the first spell on our list is a classic one. It is invisibility.
Everybody knows about invisibility, and everybody loves invisibility. Let's take a look at how this spell works.
Invisibility is a second-level illusion spell, and it's available to bards, sorcerers, warlocks, and wizards, as well as Circle of the Land druids associated with grasslands. You can find it on page 254 of the Player's Handbook.
The spell has a casting time of 1 action, a range of touch, and a duration of 1 hour. A creature you touch becomes invisible until the spell ends. Anything the target is wearing or carrying is invisible as long as it is on the target's person. The spell ends for a target that attacks or casts a spell.
You can cast invisibility at higher levels, using a spell slot of 3rd level or higher, and when you do so, you can target 1 additional creature for each slot above 2nd. This means that for a 3rd level spell slot, you can target 2 creatures, for a 4th level spell slot, you can target 3, and for a 5th level spell slot, you can target 4. Now, invisibility is the core of many, many powerful ways that player characters can bypass and explore dungeons unnoticed.
Keep in mind that with it being able to target multiple people at higher levels, if you have 2 spellcasters that have invisibility, this means that at even lower levels, they can manage to target the entire party and get everybody to turn invisible. And this pairs really well with a few other spells that can really change the way the battlefield looks.
While invisibility is an excellent way to set up an ambush or gain advantage in combat or even escape from a combat encounter, canny player characters who use the fact that invisibility can be cast on multiple characters at higher levels can then combine these spells with other concentration spells that their other party members have. Taken together, these effects allow the player characters to get really high modifiers to stealth checks and sneak their way quite deep into the dungeon without disturbing anybody or even leaving any trace of their passage.
If you have a ranger or druid in your party who can cast Pass Without Trace combined with invisibility, you have a pretty unstoppable stealth team.
Yeah, at that point, it doesn't matter that the paladin and the cleric are wearing heavy armor when they're getting an extra plus 10 bonus to their stealth checks that are being made with advantage. The entire group can really get deep into the dungeon and bypass some of those difficult combat encounters. Of course, they're going to have to deal with the fact that now they're on the other side of the enemy and figure out how to get out. So player characters can get themselves into a lot of trouble doing this. But if their goal is to get into a dungeon and steal something and get out again, or to assassinate a key target, or even just to find out what's happening in the dungeon, magicking up the rogue or a few party members and infiltrating in that way can be a pretty fail-proof tactic.
Another great combination is combining invisibility with a spell like Silence, which basically means that nobody's going to notice your party sneaking by.
Yeah, although they might notice when you sneak by and all the sound drops out in the area.
I wouldn't even cast Silence on the target. I would cast it at the area I'm sneaking through. If there was like an area right behind the enemies, I would target Silence there so that when I sneak through, I don't make a sound. The next spell we're looking at is a spell called Gaseous Form, which is found on page 244 of the player's handbook. It's a 3rd level transmutation spell.
Gaseous Form is available to sorcerers, warlocks, and wizards, although some Circle of the Land druids can also access the spell. Casting Gaseous Form takes 1 action, and it has a duration of 1 hour as long as you maintain your concentration. You transform a willing creature you touch into a misty cloud for the duration. The spell ends if the creature drops to 0 hit points. An incorporeal creature isn't affected.
While in this form, the target's only method of movement is a flying speed of 10 feet. The target can enter and occupy the space of another creature. The target has resistance to non-magical damage, and it has advantage on strength, dexterity, and constitution saving throws. The target can pass through small holes, narrow openings, and even mere cracks, though it treats liquids as though they were a solid surface. The target can't fall and remains hovering in the air, even when stunned or otherwise incapacitated.
While in the form of a misty cloud, the target can't talk or manipulate objects, and any objects it was carrying or holding can't be dropped, used, or otherwise interacted with. The target can't attack or cast spells. Gaseous Form is not a terribly popular spell, but it is one of many spells that allow the player characters to transform their movement modes in very radical ways, similar to invisibility. One of the blocks that you're going to run into with invisibility is that you can't get under a door without having to try to pick it or open it up. Enter Gaseous Form and you can just slide right in there.
One thing to keep in mind about Gaseous Form, though, is that it doesn't quite make you invisible. You do appear as a cloud, but I would argue that people are a lot less likely to notice a cloud than they are a person.
This is true, but it is something to consider. Gaseous Form shares its properties with other spells such as Fly and Windwalk, spells that allow the party to now have an enhanced mode of movement, but also one that can allow them to bypass certain kinds of environments. When you cast Fly, for instance, the party is not really going to be worried about things like castle walls or high towers. They can simply fly up to those windows and bypass that entire mage's tower that you've planned. Spells such as Gaseous Form are also really unclear when it comes to the party being able to use other abilities that might help them transport multiple party members. A really good example of this is if your low-level party has a bag of holding and the party members jump in the bag of holding and one character becomes a gaseous form, what happens? Are they able to bring the entire party with them as they sneak into the dungeon? This is really up to you as the dungeon master and the players to decide how you're going to rule it at your table. But this does allow potentially a really flawless infiltration tactic.
That is going to be a really uncomfortable bag of holding.
Oh yeah, and you don't have a lot of time too, because if you are cramming a lot of party members in there, there's not a lot of air in the bag, and you have to be worried about the weight limits of the bag itself. So again, it's not a perfect tactic.
But it is a tactic.
Windwalk is perhaps the apex example of what you can do with these kind of strategies, because it affects the entire party and allows them to really easily escape or infiltrate or travel vast distances relatively unopposed.
The next spell we're looking at is one of our favorite spells in the game, and this is Arcane Eye, which is a 4th level divination spell found on page 214 of the player's handbook and available to wizards, knowledge domain and arcana domain clerics, and also it's available to high-level warlocks who take the right invocation.
You can cast Arcane Eye with one action, and it has a duration of 1 hour as long as you concentrate on it. And it creates an invisible, magical eye within range that hovers in the air for the duration.
You mentally receive visual information from the eye, which has normal vision and dark vision out to 30 feet. The eye can look in every direction.
As an action, you can move the eye up to 30 feet in any direction. There's no limit to how far away from you the eye can move, but it can't enter another plane of existence. A solid barrier does block the eye's movement, but the eye can pass through an opening as small as 1 inch in diameter.
If you're planning a dungeon in something like a cave or cavern that doesn't have any doors or blocked off areas, you can use Arcane Eye to scout the entire dungeon without really much there to stop you.
Arcane Eye remains one of our favorites because of how I use it to foil a nasty surprise that Kelly had in store for us. Our party was exploring a cavern that was filled with these very small openings, most of them only 6 inches to 1 foot in diameter. We didn't really know what was behind them, and none of us were really brave enough to try squeezing through. So my wizard cast Arcane Eye and sent it down through the twisting passages, only to find a hidden burrow of intellect devourers hidden underneath. Kelly had been planning a terrifying encounter where we were going to get swarmed with these creatures, but of course now we knew the threat and started enacting our own plan to pour explosives down through the holes and flame out or smoke out all the intellect devourers so that we could fight them on our own terms.
Now, that was an excellent use of Arcane Eye, but I can tell you that the amount of planning I put into this devious plot was foiled almost instantly by the spell.
Now, of course, there's more ways than just Arcane Eye to do this. In fact, if you have a wizard with a familiar, they can cast invisibility on their familiar, or even transform that familiar into a relatively innocuous form, and have that familiar scout out through the dungeon and report back to them. There are some limits to the ways that the familiar can communicate to the player characters, and there's a little bit more risk there that the familiar gets destroyed and doesn't come back, and then you don't get the information you were looking for. You can also do this by casting invisibility on a rogue and sending them in alone. But the general idea here is that players do have many means at their disposal, available at pretty low levels, to scout a dungeon before having to enter it. And really, in my estimation, as a dungeon master, you should be prepared for the players to do this.
Since we're talking about 4th level spells, another easy one is if you have polymorph, you can just polymorph the rogue into a rat or spider, and they can crawl into almost any crevice or hole and find information.
The 2nd level druid could do the very same thing. In my opinion, the best way to actually solve this problem is to allow the players to take advantage of their good scouting. If the players go into a dungeon with no idea what they might be possibly encountering in there, then you have the carte blanche as the DM to hit them with the scariest things. But it's really rewarding for the players to then scout the dungeon and be like, oh man, there's tons of undead in here, or there's tons of fire elementals, so let's go stock up on fire resistance potions. And by actually making that part of the challenge, by saying to the players, okay, you prepared for this, and now you get to reap the rewards of having gathered information, to me creates a much more rewarding and interesting experience. And then you can, as a dungeon master, justify bumping up the challenge rating of all the encounters across the entire dungeon, and banking on the fact that your players will have a harder time if they don't explore beforehand, because they won't be prepared for what they encounter.
I find that to be a much cooler way to handle this than just shutting down the abilities. If you just have a magic field in front of every cave that disrupts an arcane eye or stops a magic spell from being able to penetrate it, the players are going to not be able to use the cool abilities and spells that they've taken. But this is a way to reward them for that, and it makes the players feel like there's value in the cool things that they've come up with, the interesting ideas, and you as a DM get to reward them and still play out a cool dungeon.
Now, of course, the downside of this approach is that your player characters are going to map the entire dungeon and probably use a spell like Dimension Door, our next spell on the list, to teleport directly where they need to go in the dungeon. Dimension Door is a 4th level conjuration spell, and it's available to a wide range of classes, including bards, warlocks, sorcerers, wizards, trickery domain clerics, and surprisingly Oath of Vengeance paladins, albeit at a much higher level. Which means that it's pretty likely someone in your party is going to have access to this spell.
Dimension Door has a casting time of 1 action. You teleport yourself from your current location to any other spot within a range of 500 feet. You arrive at exactly the spot desired. It can be a place you can see, one you can visualize, or one you can describe by stating distance and direction, such as 200 feet straight downward, or upward to the northwest at a 45-degree angle of 300 feet.
You can bring along objects as long as their weight doesn't exceed what you can carry. You can also bring one willing creature of your size or smaller who is carrying gear up to its carrying capacity. The creature must be within 5 feet of you when you cast the spell.
If you would arrive in a place already occupied by an object or a creature, you and any creature traveling with you each take 4d6 force damage and the spell fails to teleport you.
Dimension Door is one of many amazing teleportation effects in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and it has great tactical use in combat, but its value as an infiltration or an exfiltration escape tool cannot be understated.
Let's say your characters need to infiltrate a castle, get an item out of the throne room, and escape without being noticed. They cast Invisibility or Gaseous Form or one of the other spells we talked about to get to where they need to go. They grab the item, and just as the men are about to barge into the room, they just Dimension Door out of the castle. Well, that was their escape. There's nothing really to deal with now. They've completed the mission.
Of course, we can also use that the other way around. The player characters could use Dimension Door to get in to an environment that would otherwise be very difficult for them to get to. They could use this to bypass even effects like Walls of Force or other magical effects that they can't see behind, bypassing doors and more. Unlike lower level teleportation effects like Misty Step and Thunder Step, which require line of sight to the destination, the player characters only need to stipulate the approximate distance and deviation that they're going to travel with Dimension Door. So this even allows them, if they haven't done their homework, to make approximate guesses. For instance, if they're deep down into the dungeon, they can probably guess, okay, if I go back up 300 feet, I'm going to be back on the surface again.
There are some things out there that you can do to stop teleportation from working, things like Mordenkainen's Private Sanctum and a few other high-range spells, but generally speaking, it's pretty tough to deal with a party that has a lot of teleportation available to them.
To me, one of the most effective ways to deal with effects like Dimension Door and Thunderstep and Misty Step is to actually put lots of challenges in front of the player characters. I remember when we ran a trap-filled dungeon once, and the party ended up using a ton of teleportation effects to bypass this pool of acid, but then ran into a trap-filled hallway that was filled with traps and pits and lava jets, and all the teleportation effects were gone because the party had used all their spells on them. And so if you have instances where you suspect that the party might be using these things, just design more than one encounter where they're going to want to use them. And I guarantee you the result of this is that the first encounter, they use everything, and then they've got nothing left for the next one. And that's a really good way to make them think about using these abilities more conservatively. Because I do think that players are really gung-ho about teleporting around when they see the opportunities to do so, and don't anticipate you might need them again.
Yeah, now they've gone into a dungeon, they've teleported past all the traps, they've gotten the item, and now they're out of teleportation spells and they have to work their way back. Now, at least they know what they're dealing with, but it's still going to be a challenge.
So, as a dungeon master, you might now be thinking of all the things that you can do to prevent these spells from working. You might have a dungeon that is filled with monsters with true sight, one that is warded with Mordenkainen's Private Sanctum, one that all the doors are made of solid stone that lifts up with chains, so there's no hinges and there's no cracks for gaseous forms to sneak underwards. And actually, this is sounding like a pretty cool dungeon, and I built dungeons like this before. They're great for high-level characters. You might even populate the dungeon with wraiths and other ghosts that can move through the walls as well. And so that way to foil the characters as they might be trying to teleport around within the dungeon itself. Sounding like a pretty epic dungeon, but then the players might bust out the next spell on our list.
The next spell we're looking at is Stone Shape, which is a 4th level transmutation spell found on page 278, and it's available to wizards, clerics, and druids.
Stone Shape has a casting time of 1 action and an instantaneous duration. You touch a stone object of medium size or smaller, or a section of stone no more than 5 feet in any dimension, and form it into a shape that suits your purpose. So for example, you could shape a large rock into a weapon, idol, or coffer, or make a small passage through a wall, as long as that wall is less than 5 feet thick. You could also shape a stone door or its frame to seal the door shut. The object you create can have up to 2 hinges and a latch, but finer mechanical detail isn't possible.
So you've gone through all this work creating this impenetrable dungeon that will foil all of the spells we mentioned, and then a wizard comes up and just creates a door in the side, walks into the room that they need to get to, takes something, and walks out.
You might be thinking, oh, then let's just make the walls thicker than 5 feet. But there's many other spells like Pass Wall and Disintegrate that the party could use instead of Stone Shape, all of which allow parties to actually engage in some pretty serious underground excavation strategies, allowing them to get into very deep dungeon environments, even ones that are warded against teleportation.
Even the cantrip Mold Earth, which can manipulate loose stone or rubble, can be a great tool that the party will have at very early levels that can just dig under a wall or under a door.
And never underestimate a very determined party with lots of gold and a bunch of friendly dwarves willing to sell them explosives. There are many ways in Dungeons & Dragons that the player characters can shape the environment back, and Stone Shape, Disintegrate, Mold Earth are just a few of the magical ways that they can do so.
This is a very resource-intensive way to bypass a dungeon. With a spell like Stone Shape or Pass Wall, you're going to have to cast it on every single wall if you want to just walk through the entire dungeon, and that's going to burn through a lot of spell slots. So this is one that you don't have to worry so much about them bypassing everything, but a clever party can still use it to forego past a big encounter or a devious trap and just undo a lot of your careful planning.
Yeah, it can be a simple way for the party to solve the problem. If you can't find a good entrance, make one of your own.
On the DM side of things, a lot of these spells can derail a lot of your carefully thought out plans. And I will admit that it can be a big bummer at your table if you've spent hours, even days, planning epic encounters or really intense traps, and then the players just find a solution that you hadn't considered and bypass it. So it is very important to be aware of how these spells work and how they can impact the dungeon environments that you're building. But at the same time, players who use these spells or take these spells in the first place are excited to use them. They're excited to find those moments when one of these spells can bypass an entire encounter. And sometimes it's really nice to reward them with that and give them that opportunity where they look down at their sheet, they say, oh man, what if I cast Invisibility or Gaseous Form or Stone Shape? And everybody around the table starts to be like, oh yeah, that's a good idea. And they get really excited about it. They figure out a little loophole in the system, and you as the DM needs to reward that and be prepared for it.
And then have your villains learn from it. It's completely reasonable for a high-level vampire or lich lord or evil wizard to understand that these spells are things that exist. As we said before, they might have built their own dungeons using them, and prepare for those. Balancing out the instances where the villains and the antagonists had prepared for these kinds of strategies gives the players more reason to think ahead and use them in more creative and inventive ways. I, as a DM, always love it when my players come up with an interesting plan that circumvents or short-circuits what I've had planned in some way. And I'm always trying to prepare myself mentally for the possibility that things can go completely off any way that I ever anticipated. That's part of the fun of being a dungeon master, is rolling with the punches in that respect. Learn what the tricks of the trade are so that you know how to anticipate them, but be ready to roll with them. You'll have a lot more fun that way.
So this has been a look at 5, and a few extra, spells that can bypass dungeons in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Tell us about how you have used these spells, or any other tactics that have bypassed dungeons, in the comments below.
If you're enjoying the show, please consider supporting our work on Patreon. You can find out how you can contribute to our show by following the links in the description below.
And if you want to see a group of players fail to bypass any dungeons, check out our live play Dungeons of Drakenheim, which airs Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Eastern on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we've got many more guides to the spells in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
In the dungeon.